What is going on, best ball fans? And if you're anything like me, you've been itching to get into the lobby as soon as the Super Bowl was over. Well, if you're like me and you're a Bengals fan, you're probably waiting shortly there after the Super Bowl. But regardless, with the free agency period currently going hot and heavy right now, we just had the Davante Adams trade news just come across the wire about an hour ago. We're trying to see what the value of these players are going to be afterwards. And if you're new to best ball format, if you're new to hopping in these lobbies and seeing what everybody's talking about, it is one of the greatest ways to try and figure out what the market value is going to be. It doesn't have it's not essentially a one-to-one translation to redraft, but it does give us a good sense of what the market is valuing or how ADPs are going to shake out. And here at 4for4, we've provided a ton of content regarding the different strategies, tips, and ways to go about building rosters. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. And also here at 4for4, we've tried so many ways in order to condense a lot of the actionable content down into little tidbits, little strategies, and things that you can do in order to build optimal rosters. And a lot of it is just simple things. I mean, just these minor things that you could possibly do in order to help you out in building your roster. I mean, just simple things, just things like thinking about which teams that you want to invest in because you want to try and look at the teams that are scoring the most points or productive from a fantasy sense. I mean, investing early in running backs. I mean, trying to find those alpha running backs, the ones that also catch passes, but you don't want to invest too early, right? Because you don't want to get caught drafting in the dead zone or anything like that. Also, you need to be looking for the wide receivers as well. You do kind of want those alpha wide receivers, the Tyreek Hills and Davante Adams, but you don't want to invest too much in them also because you need to set up a balanced roster early. But also in the early rounds, you want to be drafting those good tight ends. I mean, you want Mark Andrews, you want Travis Kelce, even Kyle Pitts on your team too. But also in those early rounds, you want to be getting like two quarterbacks or at least one quarterback, the mobile guys, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Kyler Murray. You want one of those guys. Also staying away from the RB dead zone. You don't want to be drafting guys like Chris Carson in the 4th or 5th round. Stay away from that. You still also don't reach too much on those guys and don't try and jump ahead of ADP too much. But at the same time, get your guys when you want to because this is supposed to be fun. Got to be diversifying in the late rounds because you don't want to get stuck drafting any of those guys that might get cut by their teams later. Pay attention to the rookies. Don't pay attention too much, though, because you don't want to get locked in on a player that might wind up getting 2nd, 3rd, 4th round draft capital sitting on the bench, not being used all too much. So in all of that, I mean, those are just a few of the things that you could possibly do in order to help build your roster. But like I was mentioning beforehand, a lot of these tips, all of it might sound overwhelming, but what I'm going to take a look at today are just a few things that we've picked up over the past couple of seasons, looking at some historical trends to try and help you build your roster. Let's take a step back, though. Let's look at just the roster builds themselves, like the constructions themselves, and how folks have been building their rosters optimally over the past couple of seasons. Now, just last year alone, I mean, the top builds, as you can see here on the screen, I mean, 2, 5, 7, 4, like the number of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends that they're taking. You can see almost across the board for the top 4 builds in a chart provided by our director of analytics, Sam Hoppen, showing that we're investing very little in terms of draft capital into quarterbacks. 2 to 3 seem to be the optimal range. And then that split between running backs and wide receivers, we've seen the arguments between robust RB, modified RB, zero RB. I mean, any of that, even though modified zero RB isn't a thing, word to John Paulson. Seeing that split between 5, 6 running backs, but adding in a few more wide receivers, and then looking at 3 to 4 tight ends. I mean, that's about the optimal setting, the optimal build, and how many draft positions you want to allocate to your squad. But of course, the question is, when should you be drafting each of those positions? Because you can't just summarily say, well, I'm just going to draft 2 quarterbacks right off the rip. I'm going to just go 5 running backs right after that. I'll get my wide receivers and tight ends. It doesn't work in sequential. There has to be some sort of art. There has to be some sort of flow to when you're picking these guys up. So let's see how the market is reacting or how it's reacted over the past couple of years. And let's start with this position that generates the most fantasy points per game, and that's quarterback. Signal callers have now become a larger part of our focus here in the fantasy community. I mean, Rich Rebar he was the one that had coined the term Konami code quarterback. I mean, JJ Zacharyson talking about late round quarterback for what seemed like 10 years now. And we've caught on at this point. 2021, the when quarterbacks have been drafted has slightly been pushed up. You can see the concentration area in 2020 down in the 13th, 14th round to where most of the quarterbacks are being drafted. And that's now since moved up 3, 4, 5 rounds into the earlier part of drafts. No longer will you be able to draft any of the mobile quarterbacks. That one year when Lamar Jackson was the pick because he was going in the 12th and 13th round, not going to be a thing anymore. If you want a mobile quarterback, you're going to have to find them early, and you're going to have to invest that early draft capital in order to pick them up. The first round is about where you're going to need to draft like that main guy for your team, like whether it's going to be Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, if you still believe in his ability to be that RB1 like for your squad. I mean, that's when that's where folks are really trying to pick up their running backs. But as we've seen over the past few years, we've been able to find pockets of running backs at different points throughout the draft. Whether it's been towards the back end of the earlier middle stages of the draft, like where you're picking up guys like Melvin Gordon, Leonard Fournette, A.J. Dillon, or even trying to find that diamond in the rough in the 4th, 5th, and 6th round, whether it's a Miles Sanders, if you want to see if he can get you a few weeks here and there, or guys that might be falling in value thereof. So running backs are a harder breed just because workload can change. Archetype can play a big role in how they're going to be used week in and week out. But still, being able to pick out your spots, trying to grab at least 1 to 2 early, trying to focus on any of those guys in the middle rounds, and then trying to fill out or take a swing at a late round dart like anybody that invested in Rashad Penny last year wound up paying dividends for them as well. If you look at how wide receivers are treated, we're not really seeing at least the investment in the first round. If anything, traditionally we've been looking at running backs in the first round instead, and then trying to look at some of the alpha wide receivers, whether it's Devontae Adams, Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, and now with Cooper Kupp and Jamar Chase also being a part of that equation. But we've still been focusing on the running backs more so than the wide receivers. And instead of focusing on the alpha wide receivers, let's just go ahead and summarily say that we're going to focus on the wide receiver 1Bs, the high 2s. So instead of saying I'm going to draft a CeeDee Lamb or anybody in that archetype, I'll go ahead and just load up on T. Higgins. I'll go load up on Adam Thielen, Juju Smith-Schuster, Deebo Samuel. I mean, those guys that were being drafted later on in the draft, at least last year. This year, things are a bit different, obviously, but that's been the archetype of player that drafters have tried to load up on in the early parts, like 3rd through 8th round. And as you can see there on the chart, reflects like when that concentration of wide receivers have been drafted. Always been a mixed bag with tight ends, and we all know this. I mean, unless you're drafting in the top 6, grabbing anybody from a Travis Kelce to a Dallas Goedert, guys that we know have that 10 to 15% target share as a floor, or have at least touchdown equity, like a Dawson Knox, somebody like that. That's where most of our focus has been from a draft perspective. And so you can see now as we start to shift away from the early round tight end in 2020, and now it's just been more of a steady, all right, I'll grab Travis Kelce, I'll grab Mark Andrews, George Kittle, so on and so forth. But instead of that, loading up on the guys that are going to go later on in the draft, and that's where Dalton Schultz became a larger part of the focus. Pat Freiermuth last year became a larger part of our focus. Even guys like Zach Ertz, who we all felt had no value going into the season, but with the trade could. I mean, that's where the later rounds could provide some of those guys where we might not see the week in and week out target share, but at least the touchdown equity is there. The path to targets could be there. And so as we saw with the roster construction chart, needing 3 to 4 in order to get us through the entire season, not having to focus on an early round tight end, or at least being the sole focus of how we're going to build our rosters, provides at least some level of flexibility as we build out our roster, and allows us to focus on quarterback, running back, wide receiver, the positions that at least have at least a bit more stability on a week-to-week basis. So that's what the historical trends provide us. They give us some sense of how we can at least approach these drafts. But of course, here in 2022, things are changing. We've got new players coming into the league. Situations are changing, especially in free agency period. All sorts of things have now changed, like from the news that we've seen coming in and day out over the past week or so. So I wanted to point out just a few of the things that I've noticed so far hopping into the lobbies and seeing where ADP is at. Rookies in general have now become the talk of the land. If not for the free agency moves, rookie trends, or at least folks being interested in rookies, are now being a larger part of the equation. Guys like Breece Hall going at the 5-6 turn, Kenny Walker going at the end of the 8th round, Treylon Burks going in the 6th, 7th round, Garrett Wilson going at like around the 7th, 8th round as well. I mean, those guys, high draft capital, at least projected high draft capital, but also the skill set, especially when we saw most of them show out at the combine. We're expecting them to have the draft capital. We're expecting them to fall into a good situation. But in a study done by Jack Miller, he noted that in these situations, rookie production might start off slow. We're not always going to see guys like Jamar Chase come in and just completely take the league by storm, or Justin Jefferson and take the league by storm and wind up being the alpha wide receiver like right off the bat, or Najee Harris if we're looking at the running back position as well. But we can't expect that for all of the rookies. So if anything, that tends to ramp up over the entire season. We saw that with Elijah Moore. We saw that with Michael Carter to some degree as well on the same team. I mean, those are the types of trends that we can see for rookies. But now with so much news going on, and folks being excited about grabbing some of their players, reaching an ADP because everything is in flux can also be a negative thing for drafters as well. In a study performed by Hayden Winks, he showed the diminishing returns on reaching on guys depending on like where they're at in ADP. So while some folks say to go ahead and get your guys, reaching too much for them can wind up adversely affecting how you build out your roster. So it's time to hop into these lobbies. It's time to go ahead, hop in on Underdog, get into a couple of these drafts, see where some of these players are at, and build your team out. But no, over here at 444, we're going to continue to pump out some of the best content that we can, looking at how to put together these teams optimally and helping you build out your rosters so that you can take down your league. Catch y'all in the lobby.